Good morning. So my name is Stig. It's a terrible name. And it's nice to see all of you. Last name is Leschly, and I was told that I should talk for 40 minutes today. I'm not going to do that. You don't want me to do that. So I think I'm going to get some stuff out, and then I genuinely want to have questions and hear you argue with me. I'm going to make an argument, essentially. I've never been in a room of any size where most people agreed with me. So on the material that I'll cover. So the best outcome for me is I tell you what I think, and then someone in here says that's really wrong, because then I flew to San Diego to learn something. So let's do that. We have 40 minutes. I think I'll talk for, I don't really know, 15 or 20 minutes, okay? I'll tell you before I dive in sort of where it all came from. I'm going to make this argument, as you can sense, that there's no way to think about changing higher ed without new colleges. This is an idea that's been bouncing around my head for 10 years or so, and as I was actually just talking to somebody about, it originated in prior work of mine as an educator. For about 10 years, I worked at an organization called Match Education. We primarily built charter schools, and we trained teachers. So we were K-12 people. This is back in Boston. This went on for a long time. Work that I'm very proud of. These are kids who didn't have a lot. And year after year, we sent them off to college. We weren't college people, and with every passing year, it began to dawn on me what a disaster college was becoming for most of these amazing kids. I began to observe them learn very little. I noticed this sort of aggressive indifference of most colleges to what they actually needed to finish. Many of these colleges just flat out bankrupted these kids. And it got to a point where we at Match, we were 350 people at this point back in Boston, clever educators, set out to start our own community college. This is about 7, 8 years ago. At the time, we'd started a graduate school to train teachers anyway, so I was familiar with the process. We had the governor and the political people in Massachusetts behind us. One of the two things you need, as I'll talk about today, to start a college is approval under state law. Essentially, we had that. We had a lot of philanthropy to get this thing going, and we could not get accredited. It was very obvious to us that that process would not work. That was the sort of point of origin for me when I began to think about the structure and the design of higher ed, and eventually to arrive at this point of view I have about the need to build new colleges, which turns out in a very practical way, as I'll get to towards the end, to be very practically a need for a new kind of accreditor, which I'll cover. So that's where I come from in this. Let me now then sort of walk you through the argument that I'll make to you today. The first thing I'll do is just tell you very generally how I perceive higher education in America, and say a little bit about my priors, really. So because it's out of that background context that I will sort of make the argument that I'll make to you. So I heard someone say not long ago that the US college sector is a government-funded cartel 50 years in the making. A government-funded cartel 50 years in the making. I don't specifically or literally subscribe to that view. I don't think it actually qualifies as a cartel, but directionally, I have a hard time arguing with that line. It is nearly impossible to start a college. There are about 5,000 of them in the US today, give or take how you count. A majority of them are public universities, 2- and 4-year. And there are about 5,000 of them 50 years ago. There have been some introductions of new colleges. There was a blip in this pattern around the for-profit colleges when one particular accreditor began to approve them, but they were never material. At their peak, they educated 10% of kids. And they're almost gone now. 90% of enrollment in American colleges, 90% has been stable in a couple thousand colleges for half a century. So this is a space where you do not enter, number one. Number two, there really is no exit in this space. We'll get into this a little bit, but the pressure on these incumbents is minimal from the state agencies and from the federal government that otherwise does have the authority to regulate them tightly. And it is massively, massively subsidized, beginning with the Higher Education Act in sort of mid-century. Give you an idea, if you count the cash coming into an American community college, that's a third of the American college sector, if you just count that cash, 70 to 80% of it originates in state and federal direct funding for colleges. So think Title IV aid, that's the Pell Grant, and think state appropriations directly to colleges, 70, 80% of the money. In a public four-year college, that number is around 50 to 55%, and in the private four-year colleges, which are enroll a minority of our students, it's around a third, and I'm not counting the loans. I'm not counting the loans. So the government is paying for this thing. You can't start a new one, and once you are one, you live on for a very long time. And so when you organize a sector in this way, I think you're guaranteed to arrive at where we have arrived at, which is a world where the prices have gone up ahead of inflation every year for 40 years. It's the most inflated product in American society. We can argue about how to measure the output or the quality of the outcomes in this sector. They haven't changed much, and the graduation rates, for example, are staggering. They're also underreported. I would bet if we polled everybody in this building, 25% of the people in this building could describe the graduation rates in community colleges or in a prevailing American college. You have a coin flip chance of finishing, and if you're a vulnerable student of some kind, or if you go to certain kinds of colleges, those numbers plummet. The earnings outcomes that are coming more and more to light make the cost and the ROI on this thing very, very dicey now and flat out dangerous at times. And demand is up. So we've moved from college being rare in American society now to it being in the lives of a very large majority of high school graduates now. We've moved from 4 to nearly 20 million college students now. So prices up, quality down, demand up. And there's a very, very powerful herding dynamic that we've created, and I think this is where the immorality of this phenomenon starts to really appear, at least for me, which is, as a society, as a set of governments, we walk up to an 18-year-old and we say there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we're massively funding your future. Here's a Pell Grant. We'll lend money to you infinitely. It's becoming almost free. We're massively funding on the supply side of these institutions. So we're very invested financially in your future, but we're constraining you to this incumbent set of 5,000 colleges. And as a result, it's very, very difficult for students to go anywhere else because the enormous public subsidy crowds out the formation of alternative institutions. And so we point students into, this was my match anecdote, into these colleges that increasingly are too expensive and don't do enough. So that's me on higher ed, for starters. Out of that background perspective, I hold the view that the two prevailing movements in public policy to change higher ed will not work. You can organize most public policy conversation in America around colleges into either talk about funding more or funding smarter colleges. You read about that all the time. Let's increase the amount of subsidy, or let's tie the subsidy to the incumbents in some intelligent way to performance outcomes. And the other categorical movement in higher ed policy is accountability. You'll hear talk of Let's make the outcomes more transparent so that consumers might police colleges in their choices. Or on the margin, let's tighten the sneakers on colleges that underperform. So this would be, for example, the gainful employment rules that are back on the table in DC. But they're very marginal accountability arguments because they're so constrained by, this is on the accountability side, the impossible politics of closing a college, a school of any kind. Ample evidence of this in K-12. Even an underperforming school, even a perilous school, same is true of universities, are deeply, deeply protected in their communities, in their stakeholder set. It's very difficult to close these things. But the deepest, I think, delusion or problem in prevailing talk of higher ed is the overestimation, the false presumption that colleges can change. This is a very, very important misunderstanding in my mind. So just think about this for 1 minute. We're talking about organizations, these 5,000 that have been around for decades, that are tied up with 90% of their cost structure in fixed obligations, literally buildings and deeply protected staff. They're protected in civil service regulations in 2/3 of the instances because they're public universities, in labor contracts, in union negotiations, and in tenure. So you're imagining change in an organization that can't relocate its costs, number one. Number two, I work at one of these universities, and I've been in their governance meetings. They are not designed to make difficult decisions in any way. There literally is nobody in charge. And thirdly, almost all American colleges are structurally bankrupt. They have no cash in the bank. They live quarter to quarter, payroll to payroll, so they can't invest in the losses that invariably would accompany change. And so all the arguments about accountability and smarter funding are operating on the premise of the incumbents. And for those of you who are private sector people, think about this. Would we ever walk up to a sector, notice 5,000 existing operators, and decide we're going to refund them and re-regulate them into innovation? But that is exactly the project. Okay, so that is my backstory or fundamental view of what we're talking about. And so I can only think of two complete, plausible stories for how this changes, really changes. One of them, which I will not talk about today, and which I'm not in favor of, so long as I still have hope about the second one, is simply to end it. And this could happen sooner than we think. Imagine the following thought experiment. Congress writes into Title IV of the Higher Education Act one line that says, hey, student, here's your grant, here's your Pell Grant, here's your loan, and in addition to using it to go shop over there among the 5,000 colleges, you also have an alternative now, which you could exit higher education and go spend it on a company-based apprenticeship or a training program of some kind. That reform movement, let's call it freeing Title IV, would end half of American colleges within 2 years, I predict. Try to imagine a low-income student with a Pell Grant given the choice to go to a community college or to go and buy training in a company. I mean, you would have enormous exodus. It's another way of saying that college exists in a significant way now as the artificial byproduct of public finance, and one could divest out of it simply by making Title IV portable. It would create an enormous regulatory task because you would point over $100 billion a year in subsidy in the hands of students right out into the private sector. I don't take that lightly at all, but there may come a point where solving that problem is easier than solving the one we're trying to solve, which is the colleges. And also, I've actually never met a student, especially a student who didn't have a lot coming up, who wouldn't mind the option. It's very easy for me, where I live in progressive circles, to find people wanting to hold on to college, but this is wildly popular among the people who matter the most, who are the students. So that is a complete argument for change. for another day. And so here comes the argument for new colleges. Imagine, well, I've been walking around this building for a couple days. The place is full of entrepreneurs. People with ideas, people who are driven, people who want to experiment. They're solving all kinds of problems except one. There isn't a single entrepreneur in this building that's going off to start a new college. It's an elephant in the room to me. The combination of everything that's happening in this building completely misses, to me, the staggering centerpiece, the open option we have to point all. Something exciting happening at home. Something exciting happening here. Okay. Is this obvious thing. So, anyway, there it is. Think about this for a minute. Watch all these humans. I was watching, Garrett Lord walked by me a minute ago. Garrett Lord and his friends started Handshake. They actually went off and fixed one diseased piece of American higher ed. It's the Career Services Office. Can you imagine if they actually could build the whole college? Say another thing. There is no actual innovation in higher ed, folks. There's not a lot of, so there are things on the margin that I admire greatly. I spent a day yesterday here with Paul LeBlanc. Western Governors is a good example. It's sort of the counterfactual. It's a new college. It's relatively new. It took a bus full of governors, by the way, and an extraordinary accreditation workaround to get it moving. There's innovation there. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit cheaper. It's a little bit more flexible. Most colleges are not changing. Most applications of technology have nothing to do, folks, with innovation. Most online stuff is like a 2002 era website. It's a lot like when the Britannica Encyclopedia went on to the CD-ROM. I used to work at Amazon. I know what innovation and change looks like. You can't see it. You can't imagine what it would look like because we have not unleashed the new teams, the creativity, the applications of technology. It would be immensely suspenseful to set it afoot. And I think it's completely possible to imagine colleges, if they're redesigned from scratch, that literally would dramatically lower costs. They would finally unbundle. They would create enormous variation and just leaps forward in outcomes, particularly the crucial outcome that folks matters to 80% of college goers, which is they just want to make a living. And so the earnings results of these outcomes. So that's the future that is almost impossible to imagine because it's barely even been allowed to take hold inside of this closed space that is blocked from entry. You need two things to start a college, like I mentioned. You need a governor and a state board of higher ed to say yes. That's hard but doable. We did it at Match. We started a graduate school. We were on our way to do it for a community college. This happens, and there are some state jurisdictions that are more friendly than others to this. That's a hard but solvable thing to acquire in state law, in state regulation, the licensure to be a college granted degree. As a practical matter, you also need accreditation. It's not a legal requirement to be a college, but you cannot qualify for financial aid, particularly Title IV, absent being accredited. Here's a quick primer on accreditation. They wrote the GI Bill 70 years ago. It was the first time the federal government got interested in higher ed. The veterans came back, they had some money for college. They needed an entity or a type of entity to vet colleges. Trade associations of colleges had been around for 100 years. In the GI Bill, they point to accreditors and say to the veterans, you can go buy college with the GI Bill as long as they're accredited. A couple years later, they pass the Higher Ed Act, and the torrent of federal finance for higher ed begins, and the accreditors by then got installed as the gatekeepers of federal financial aid. 7 of them accredit 9 colleges that serve 95% of American college-going students. These are often referred to as regional accreditors. They are hiding in plain sight in American society. They're deeply, deeply powerful institutions. Their dues are paid for by their members. Their boards are composed of their members. So you have a situation where the trade associations of colleges, these accreditors, are a gating factor to becoming a viable college. This is for another day too, they do very little to sanction or to discipline colleges for poor student outcomes or low-grade academic designs, period. And they also, in effect, block entry. I can think of a handful, you guys can too probably, of new colleges that have gotten through. They're like extraordinary feats of perseverance. It takes 10 years, let's say, to get it done with no guarantee up front. It's incredibly expensive. And so as a practical matter, it's almost impossible to do. And I would argue that there is a very, very capable, talented, suppressed supply of would-be college entrepreneurs. Even nonprofit colleges, so they would come out of ed tech, they're in this building. I know humans who work inside of established colleges who would love the opportunity to go start one from scratch and design it. There are lots of people I came up with in the charter school movement who are dying to forward integrate into college. And again, it's almost impossible to do because of the accreditation block. And especially if you're interested in serving kids who come from low-income households, you have to get into the line of the Pell Grant. Because remember, the publicly financed, publicly subsidized bad college will always beat the unsubsidized good college. That's the crowding out effect. So we need a new accreditor, I think. If I go on too long about here, you guys will all run screaming from the room because behind this slide is a very, very obscure, technocratically difficult set of regulations in Washington, D.C. that govern the formation of a new accreditor. There is a pathway to do it. The one that I think, the accreditor that, if built, could start this new college movement would be one that, if it were up to me to design it, would accredit, first of all, startup colleges. I would limit its accreditation to startups to nonprofit projects. That's a longer conversation. We can get into it in Q&A. And the reason I have that view is largely a practical one. There is no political mandate for for-profits. I also think they're very, very tricky to regulate. But it's okay. There are a lot of extraordinarily talented educators and social entrepreneurs who have ideas about colleges. So we have plenty of nonprofit supply on the talent side. And I also think there's a mountain of philanthropy in this country that would underwrite the startup losses of nonprofit colleges. So the new accreditor, as I imagine it, would create a rigorous, demanding, but predictable pathway into the college space for startup colleges. Imagine being approved over 12 to 24 months to begin, rather than being put on a boat to nowhere to get approval. So first of all, credit for startups. Second of all, a credit for outcomes. In defense of the taxpayer money, I think a little will go a long way. And I think if you were simply to hold colleges accountable for the short-term earnings outcomes of their students and to adjust the measurement of these colleges for their student inputs, because two colleges can be completely different. They'll have the same outcomes depending on who they enroll. So some simple, hard-nosed, clever ways of measuring with adjustments for student inputs, short-term earnings outcomes, that's absolutely vital. That is the primary public policy give back for the funding is economic safety, economic mobility, a free and better life at work for students. A credit for transparency, just make colleges open books. Because most of I'm imagining a world of an enormous variety of colleges. And so it's vital that students and families have full visibility into every aspect of these colleges, because most of the attributes of colleges need to be chosen for by students, not governments. I'm pretty design neutral on what these colleges would do, but for their producing earnings outcomes. So you want to make them, you force colleges into being total open books with their families, and otherwise just remain design neutral, and very importantly, deconflicted. You need an accreditor that's at arm's length from the colleges that it regulates. So it can't be dependent on the dues from these things, from its portfolio colleges. It can't be governed by the colleges, of course not. If deconflicted, then an accreditor could responsibly de-accredit a college that underperforms. That's the accreditor we need. It's an untested practical formation problem in sort of federal regulations. If 3 of us in this room were to go start an accreditor, we have to incorporate it, seat a bunch of commissioners, spend, call it 4 or 5 years doing basically 2 things. 1, writing all the protocols. I'm describing just a few of the novel ones, but there's an enormous set of required protocols of accreditors by the Department of Ed. So the formation and articulation of all of these protocols. And then secondly, you have to partner with a couple of colleges to basically practice your protocols. Then it's 4 or 5 years later, and there's a huge set, there's a very intense sign-off procedure in Washington, D.C. The civil servants in the Department of Ed have to say yes. Secondarily, a political body I'm almost certain none of you have heard of called NASIKI has to say yes. That's a board that's seated by Congress. And then thirdly, the political appointees, so essentially the White House, the then sitting political appointee in the Department of Ed has to say yes. So to form an accreditor is to form what might be the most politically sort of vetted institution that you can imagine, and that's for good reason. Because that accreditor, in approving colleges, new colleges, has the authority to point over $100 billion of federal financial aid at new startup colleges. But were that to happen, I can easily imagine 5, then 50, then 200 new teams arriving over time with extraordinary ideas. And the last thing I'll say, and we can open it up, it's easy for me to imagine very quick demand shifts in higher ed, away from incumbents towards startups. Half of the money, public money in higher ed, has essentially taken the form of a voucher to students. It's called the Pell Grant and a loan. They dispense and control and choose with that subsidy. In contrast to the other half of higher ed finance, which is state legislatures directly to public universities. But so much of the funding in higher ed is controlled by students, wielded by students. It's essentially a voucherized sector. So if you get new, good nonprofit providers in, the demand shifts can come really fast. Notice the movement to Southern New Hampshire University, Western Governor University, sort of sensible, marginally novel online providers that are, I'm not actually arguing for that design as the winning ones per se, but wherever even a little bit of innovation shows up in higher ed, there are enormous and quick demand shifts. So if we could get 5, then 50, 200 new colleges started, imagine this in the community college space, for example. And I think many of the new designs would enter there. I think many of them would get into the 4-year space around jobs outcomes because I think there's just a lot of sort of open design space there that could be occupied. That's my talk. And it took 29 minutes. So now there's 10 minutes left for you to tell me why I'm wrong. Please. Go ahead. And just state your name for the crowd.
Yeah, Kevin here.
Hi, Kevin.
I'm not going to tell you why you're wrong, because I agree with virtually everything that you said. My question would be, let's say you get the accreditation. Mm-hmm. There's still other pieces of defensibility that protect these incumbents, like campuses, like credentials that employers and parents trust, and plenty about sports teams.
Yep. Yeah.
To different segments of the market, different pieces of that defensible value prop matter more and less. Mm-hmm. If you, let's say you got the accreditation, or maybe said differently, you took over an existing college, you had that, and you can do whatever you want with it. Mm-hmm. What segment of like the college audience market would you go at when you think they're the most right for a new model?
Yeah. I believe that 80% of American college goers are furious Truly do. A third of them go to two-year community colleges. A third of them end up in non-selective four-year privates. Yeah, they might have a football team, and they might have a campus, though far fewer do than we think, but they're also incredibly expensive, and your odds of finishing are low. They're four-year public. So I struggle I think there is a small number of branded selective colleges, right, that will be around. Whether they earn the right to be around or whether they're so wired into networks now, I'm not so certain. It's a tiny little outpost of American higher ed. Remember, 10% of American college-going kids, 10% go to a college that admits less than half their applicants. Did you hear that? Half go to non-selective institutions. 90% of them go to colleges that admit more than 50%. There are only 20 colleges in America, 20, that admit less than 10% of their students. So colleges are non-selective institutions where you can go if you can pay. And I think they're all extraordinarily vulnerable to new designs that we haven't even imagined. And look, if someone wants to pay $50,000, $60,000, and go watch the football team and live in a dorm and go to a dining hall, if they want the bundled product, the universe we're describing, they're still around. But I think the space is wide open for innovation and disruption. Yeah.
I had heard, I think it was President Obama made public the value, presumably from what I've read, of institutions based on where the people went, maybe using IRS data. Was that of any value?
Say one more thing about what you're referring to. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm not that aware. I read in the general newspaper that the government, to help solve this problem, was going to give the consumer data so they know that if you go to the institution, so many percent of the students graduate, so many people get jobs in their field. They were maybe even going to use tax returns for people who got left. And I wondered whatever happened with that.
Yes. I think you're referring to the evolution over the last 10 years of something called the College Scorecard, which is a federal database. It's actually, I can sit and stare at it. I think it's really cool. You can, college by college, notice what the graduation rates are. And of late, in particular, you can look at the earnings outcomes of graduates and of entrants. And there are a lot of calculators now where that's done even by major. I'll just say one more thing about that. That which predicts your earnings outcomes more than anything else is the major. It's not how much you pay to go to college. It's not even really the college. So it's exactly what you would think. If you major in something that leads into a viable sector of the economy, you'll do better economically. But yes, there's a lot of data there. There's not a lot of evidence that it's causing colleges to get better. Why? Where are students going to go? They're choosing among colleges that are deeply, deeply sort of centralized in their outcomes. And there's just not a lot of choice. So again, this is the transparency argument. We're going to give students data. They will show up and with their consumer choice behavior, discipline and police colleges. There is some effect, particularly in the choice among majors. You can see that. So colleges will start to shut down unproductive majors and favor the more productive ones, in part because students are demanding them. So the percentage of students who are enrolled in computer science degrees now is skyrocketing. So there's some choice effect there, but there's not a lot that's causing the turnover that I imagine, which is really the full throttle sort of pressure on colleges to change wholesale. There's another misunderstanding. I think there are students who are now defecting and leaving colleges. Enrollments are down. Some of that's going to have to do, we'll realize, with COVID, but some of the students are leaving. It's finally gotten so bad, meaning so expensive, so unlikely to cause you to graduate, that they're like, okay, I'm going to give up my subsidy. I'm going to lay off the Pell Grant and the loan and set out on my own now, even though the institutions have not flourished outside of higher ed, other than the employers, just to set sail on that alternative path. So we're at a point now where it's so expensive, it's so perilous for students that they're walking away marginally from the massive herding subsidy, the strong public policy we have that sends them into the college space. So short answer is, I think there's some payoff to transparency and data, but it won't fundamentally create new actors or innovation in the space. You're still dealing with the same incumbents, which for the reasons I described, can't really change, I think. Yes?
I have one question. So I'm from Europe, from Germany, so we have quite a different university system. And what I'm wondering is, how big do you see the risk for the American university and college system as a whole to maybe lose the war against a starting globalization of university degrees? So with the rise of online, now it's possible for many students to do a German bachelor and master degree for 100 euros per month.
So a couple things. Remember, students will go where they can go with their subsidy. 72% of American college-going kids rely on public aid in some way to go to college right now. It's either the loan or the grant. And I haven't seen any proposals to send Title IV aid, to universities in Germany. So I think there's going to be a limit there. I also am not smart enough to predict how much of this ends up online versus place-based versus some hybrid of the two. So the other thing is the R&D function of American universities, which is amazing, I think is sound. It's also localized in a tiny number of universities across the 5,000 we're describing. So strongly segregate, people fail to do this all the time. The thing that makes the American higher education system great is often the research and development function in it that's driven so much of our economy in the life sciences and in the digital sciences. Separate that totally from the educational problem we're talking about here, which I think is something has to give here. So on the politics of this, I remember I came up in the K-12 reform movement. This is a middle-class issue in American society. The K-12 problem is not. It's not. Middle-class American families, because they can choose and move from community, are generally speaking at ease with the K-12 schools. It's poor families in K-12 who have no political constituency to protect them, who are struggling in K-12. By contrast, in higher ed, 70% of American households are furious now. So something I think might give, hopefully productively. If you completely nationalize this and make college free, which is super potent politically, it's a mess. Because you take these 5,000 incumbents and now you make free that institution and prolong it without really improving it. It's not enough. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Erin with Reach University. So the only argument that I will make is that you can start your university. We're about 10 years old-ish. You can get accredited. We're WASC accredited by regional accreditor. It's hard, for sure. There are new accreditors out there. WATIA, Workforce Training and Education Association, is making its way. QA Commons is making its way. Everything else you said, I absolutely agree with. But there are ways to start new, and we're really looking at, primarily we're educator prep, K-12 districts, all these pieces. But what I'm working on too is how do we look at truly job embedded? Like, what are you doing in the field? How do we partner with workforce and still offer the traditional looking credits, which is a whole other story, but how do we do that and make it work? And it can, and I think that, just being able to get out there, talk about it, arguments like you're making for sure, there are people thinking about it, and I think that, it's moving in the right direction. Is it hard? Absolutely. And,
appreciate it.
We've got a lot of challenges ahead. But
Just to glow on Reach a little more, so I know Mallory well, so this is if you want to look at an example of smart people doing clever things in the redesign out on the frontier of innovation, look at Reach, a small university in California, was affiliated with what briefly was an alternative accreditation pathway run by WASC, now shut down, that had as its aspirations to approve new colleges, eventually closed down. But Reach is associated with that. There are a few in California. I'll stand by. How few there are out there that can get through the meat grinder that is accreditation approval. But when they do come out the other side, Dennis Leschly got one going in Rhode Island. There's a man named Donnell Butler who's sort of come out of the KIPP universe who's trying to start a school. There are a sort of vanguard that are trying through traditional accreditation to get a footing so they can begin to innovate. Yes, please.
So I have a back toward like what was before in a lot of the schools because of other policies that exist. So a question I have for you is these new universities pop up and they're very innovative in the first decade.
Yeah.
What else exists that will then push them back to the same model that it's always been? Because I feel like that's what's happening with K-12.
Yeah, we should talk because we're almost out of time. I think, again, there's consumer choice in higher ed, which has no equivalent in K-12. That's the first thing to remember. And second of all, I think these innovative colleges that get out via this accreditor, I think de facto from the beginning would look radically different. I think the cost structure would look so profoundly different. I don't imagine buildings of the same kind, and I don't imagine salary and staff commitments at the same time. And again, if they're producing outcomes, they'll just keep marginally innovating around that. I think the branding problem is really hard for startup colleges. I think they can solve it, I would predict, by partnering with branded employers is probably how they get the brand puzzle solved, which does matter to consumers. The clock says 0. Thank you all very much. Appreciate you coming in.